I would like to invite you to imagine for a minute that we are all gathered around an open fire. So maybe you can stretch your hands out and warm up. And the reason why I want to do that is that's where my story begins. And this open fire was many years ago, far away from here, in actually the Great Rift Valley of Ethiopia. The morning before I sat around that fire, I had slept outside on an open cot on the land of Halima and her husband Gedi and their 3 kids, Shilla, Bantu, and Abdo. And as I was falling asleep in the sort of moonlight, starlight, I could see the small field of wheat they had planted and they grew each year, and the outline of acacia trees and the thatch roof of their hut. And during the night, I woke up off and on. Sometimes the donkey was braying, sometimes the not too distant cackle and laugh of hyenas. But I woke for good in the morning, sort of just before the sun rose, and I could hear the voices inside the hut, and particularly the scream of little Abdo, because children all around the world wake up hungry, and he was about 6 months old, and he wanted people to do something about it. So somebody got up. I don't know if it was Halima or Gedi, or maybe one of the older kids, and took some sticks and put them on the coals of the fire that had died down overnight to begin to warm the hut. And by the time I had joined them, they were gathered around the fire, and I was there, and Gedi was next to me, and he had a sort of a bowl of porridge, a kind of a casket of porridge that he was stirring, and Halima was nursing Abdo. And I just was sort of struck in this moment, obviously, about sort of how closely this family and the others, there's a village of about 1,000 people, lived to sort of the rhythms of nature and the earth. And obviously I don't want to romanticize that because it's a very hard existence and full of risk and uncertainty. When the rain doesn't fall, for example, crops do not grow, and when the crops don't grow, hard times come. But when the rain does fall and the crops grow, it can be a very good life. And so as I spent my time with them for about a week, I was there as a journalist. Personally, I was just struck by, in talking to them and being with them, sort of the strength that they took from these rhythms and this sort of confidence. And that sort of sat with me. I did a lot of reporting in remote and sort of parts of the world, and found myself in similar situations in the Amazon and the Russian far north, in the Arctic, and along the banks of the Mekong. And as I would come back and forth in these steel tubes, or aluminum tubes, I suppose, these airplanes through the sky into this industrial world, of course I was happy to have the benefits that we all are fortunate enough to have. But at the same time, I could feel what we have sort of lost as well, which is sort of a sense of how we live in relationship to the natural world. And of course, that's a problem. Dave had mentioned climate change, and we've known for decades, right, that this is the scale of our consumption is a problem. And so I want to take you now to a second place. This is a little journey to 3 places where I slept along, what ended up being a years-long journey. This is a literal and figurative world away from the Great Rift Valley, the plains of North Dakota. And this time we end up in an alfalfa field. A farmer had told me as I was walking down the road with my backpack, long story as to why, but he said, "You can sleep in my alfalfa field." And if, like me, you didn't know what alfalfa looks like, it grows like thyme or marjoram. It's kind of a bushy little plant. And I had made my way out into the middle of this pasture and set up my tent. And I was not there, though, just to camp. I was there because it was the Bakken oil field, and it was the boom of 2014, which was essentially the largest oil production boom in decades, and has since, I'll get to that. Just over the ridge from where I was sleeping was an oil rig, 200 feet high. There were hundreds of them in western North Dakota at the time, drilling down 2 miles, 4-inch pipe, 24 hours a day. And when it got 2 miles down, it would turn and go 2 miles through a layer of shale called the Bakken. And once they got the pipe down, it would be pulled out, and millions of gallons of water mixed with chemicals would be pumped down at high pressure to fracture the rock and bring up the oil. Of course, we all use that oil to fly in airplanes and to drive our cars. And it's, as one oil worker told me, it's in everything. It's in our shoes, it's in our phones, this petroleum, right? In any event, so there I was in my little tent, and I could hear the kind of grinding on this platform. And I had gone there to try to get close to some sense of the scale of our consumption, and of, I guess, kind of theoretically my consumption too. And so, it was a little scary in the field that night. There was no one aside from the rig for miles around. The rancher had told me, oh yeah, there are mountain lions in the Blue Buttes, which roll around. I'm like, cool. I would prefer the hyenas. But, but it was scary because, I could feel up close sort of how much we use. In the 5 years prior to me being there, over 8,000 wells were dug. And the month I arrived, 1 million barrels a day were being harvested. And this is actually at a time when we know that's exactly the wrong thing we should be doing, right, as a society. Just one little data point. Similarly, that same year, atop a Mauna Loa volcano in Hawaii, a measuring instrument measured an important benchmark, which was 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which hadn't been crossed in many, many, many millennia, if not millions of years. I'm forgetting up here, sitting here, but a long time. But it had catapulted from the low 200s to over 400 during the Industrial Revolution, right? And it's a way they can fingerprint carbon in the atmosphere and know that what comes from the burning of fossil fuels. And so there's a pretty clear link, right? So as we know that, like, we've got to change, here they were, like, drilling, and we were buying it, and I was going to fly home on an airplane fueled by it. And so it was kind of a weird, scary situation in the field, and just on the other side to the west on a ridge was a flare, because what happened is they drilled the wells so quickly that the natural gas that comes up too, because there's a lot of stuff underground obviously, normally would be captured and taken to market, but they didn't have time, so they would just burn it. And so these 40-foot flames, and if you Google Bakken oil field at night, you'll see it. It makes a glow bigger than Minneapolis or Chicago. And in any event, this flare was there, and I could see it through my tent walls, my little nylon tent walls. And I have to say, it was kind of freaky, but it was also, I felt kind of alive, because I felt, in some ways, some industrial equivalent of being closer to kind of what keeps us going and sort of what we take and what we need. And I felt like I had sort of a sense of the scale of the problem, right? It became more tangible. I'd always felt here in places like this that were warm when it's cold, or cold when it's warm, or driving around in my car, sort of over-insulated, right? So we hear there's a problem, but I kind of felt like I couldn't connect to that. So last but not least, I want to go to a place not so different, although a little farther away still, in the panhandle of West Texas. I don't know if anyone's ever been out there, but like North Dakota, it also is flat, but it also is very windy. There are plenty of windy places, of course, along the ocean and in the mountain ranges and in North Dakota and the northern plains, but there's nowhere as windy in the United States as the panhandle of Texas. It blows pretty much all the time, certainly in 24-hour cycles at very high rates. And so when I walked out into a field there was not alfalfa but cotton. It was early spring, and the cotton had been harvested the fall prior, and so there were just the kind of the craggly cotton plants with little tufts of leftover cotton that hadn't been taken in the harvest. And I pitched my tent to spend the night, and about 100 yards to the east was a 150-foot wind turbine, and 100 yards to the west was a 150-foot wind turbine. And when I had walked out there, I don't know if you've ever been close to one of these things, but I stood underneath the first one, and I said 150 foot. I should have said 300 meters, 300 feet high. And the blades themselves are 150 feet around. And you can feel the power of these things. It's like this whomp, 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 whomp. Literally you can feel it in your chest. Like I was like, yeah, my chest is moving. I thought for a minute I would pitch my tent there for the night, right underneath one, because I just thought that would be kind of cool. But it was a little too close for comfort, because then I started thinking, you're alone in a field for a while, you start to think of things, and I was like, do these things ever fall off? Where do they land? What do they do? And so I went a little bit to the side in between the two wind turbines, and it was blowing like crazy. And so I got in my tent at night, And I had talked to a wind energy specialist before I started my little odyssey around the West Texas Panhandle. And he had told me about these diurnal patterns of wind that it sort of peaks sometime after midnight, will drop off, and by just before dawn will not be blowing at all. I kind of missed that, by the way. Like, I didn't know that, sleeping in a house my whole life. I was like, wow, all this stuff going on. But, you know, and so as I was falling asleep, the sides of my tent were flapping like crazy. But when I woke up near dawn, it was still, completely still, to the point that the turbines weren't turning. But they had done their job, because these turbines there were two, but they were two of thousands that have been built in Texas in the last several years for a number of reasons, political and financial. Texas embraced the wind energy boom to the point that when I was there in March of 2017, on one particular Friday night, the grid, the electricity grid of Texas, okay, so Texas is the only state in the nation that has its own grid within its boundaries. But think about this: Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, everywhere, right? Every hospital, convenience store, strip mall, apartment air conditioning unit, everything, all the energy that was being drawn from the grid, over 50% of it was being produced by wind energy. And so it's a very real enterprise out there. And so I was, you know, as I was sort of laying there near daybreak in my tent, first of all, I was freezing, because it was 26 degrees, and I wisely chose my lightweight sleeping bag, which was good to 45. So I was wearing everything that I had with me in my pack, but I had sort of, in a weird way, accomplished what I didn't know I was looking for, thinking back to the Gebby and Halima's hut, or to these other places I had been, which is I just felt very connected to our consumption and how we might live in a way that is a little more in keeping with the rhythms of the earth. And so I knew that the wind energy expert had told me, by the way, he says, you know, the sun's going to come up. It's going to heat the air. So probably about 30 or 40 minutes after sunrise, those turbines are going to start cranking again. And so I was waiting for that to happen. And of course, the wind, also on the wind, the day before I had seen flocks of sandhill cranes flying from their winter grounds in sort of southern Mexico and parts of Central America up to the Arctic. They fly, you know, up to a quarter of a mile above the Earth, flying along on these currents that they've been doing for, I suppose, thousands of years. And I just kind of felt a little more at peace and a little more confident, and some of that perhaps strength in a way that comes from knowing the scale of our consumption and sort of an awareness of it. And so, yes, I was freezing, and I was not, you know, it was much colder than I would have been had I been home in New Hampshire, about a quarter mile away, in my bed, but I also knew that I was warm enough. Thank you.